The Duke of Monmouth is bailed. The news spread quickly. But despite his reprieve from the Tower of London, it was hardly a cause for celebration. The King, Monmouth's father, has forbid him coming into the park or any part of Whitehall, as well as when His Majesty is out of town as in it. The King is very angry with him, and resolved to take every way to undeceive the world that he is not. Monmouth's main political supporter and Whig heavyweight, the Earl of Shaftesbury, was also losing patience with the Duke. Shaftesbury fumed that the Duke had had 3 golden opportunities to seize the crown. When he was being arrested at Stafford, the time when he was Captain General of the Army in Scotland, and during his famous royal tour of the West Country. Yet Monmouth, despite his several failings, knew that none of those times were suitable opportunities for rebellion. There was not enough support for him, alongside still too much support for his father, the King. Shaftesbury would not concede the point, and went into hiding near his army in Wapping. Riddled with gout and full of bitterness at the lack of action, he was still adamant that he would yet still put the nation to flame and to raise a rebellion. Monmouth was reported at snapping at Shaftesbury and saying, "Your hot head and airy notions would be the ruin of them all." Shaftesbury countered by suggesting Monmouth return to Cheshire, where he had just had an incredibly successful progress. There he still had a chance to launch a national revolt. A revolt at last to put Monmouth on the throne, and to rid the country of the Papist Duke of York, and his equally Catholic brother, the King. Shaftesbury badgered Monmouth's close colleague, Lord Grey. "My Lord Grey," he began, "if you wish well to the Duke of Monmouth, to the Protestant interest, to yourself and all of us that are concerned, you must cheat him this time and tell him it is the advice of my Lord Russell, myself and all the friends in the city that he go back into Cheshire. Nothing but that can save England." Shaftesbury showed himself again the armchair theorist he was. He believed it would only take a few great men like Monmouth, Essex and Russell to go into the streets, brandish their swords and shout, "In the name of liberty, go!" Bishop Burnet, who we have heard from before, saw things differently and perhaps more clearly. He wrote, "The Earl of Shaftesbury believed the first appearance of the least disorder would have prevailed on the King to yield everything. But the Duke of Monmouth, who understood what a rabble was and what troops were, looked on this as a mad exposing of themselves and their friends. This knowledge of what was a rabble and what constituted trained troops would be a great help and perhaps a great burden to Monmouth in the years to come. But this splintering between Monmouth and Shaftesbury would lead to more sinister and desperate plots, and not only plots, but plotters. But what kind of men would begin to put these treasonous plots into action? There was Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Walcott, described as a loud-mouthed Irishman, a man who had guarded King Charles I up to a scaffold. Colonel John Rumsey, a tax collector, an ex-Cromwellian officer. Nathaniel Wade, a Bristol lawyer, who plays a significant part in the Monmouth Rebellion of 1685. Robert West, a barrister and student of Machiavelli, and Richard Goodenough, an under-sheriff of London. Alongside this motley collection of professionals and hard men was Major Wildman, another of Cromwell's former officers, and described as a bold and desperate fellow. William Hone, a joiner, Thomas Shepherd, a merchant, nonconformist and follower of the preacher and pamphleteer Robert Ferguson. Francis Cholton, a libertarian teacher. Josiah Keeling, an Anabaptist, a dyer by trade and declared bankrupt. And most importantly, Richard Rumbold, a one-eyed maltster whose wife had inherited a large property near Hoddesdon in Hertfordshire. The property was called RYE House. This ragtag band of desperadoes and disaffected characters, with their differing views and varied goals, would resemble Monmouth's army in a couple of years' time. Monarchists with Republicans, Anglicans with Dissenters, Puritans with Anabaptists. And amid this infamous group was the chief plotter, Robert Ferguson, and it would be his stirrings and agitations that would begin the next plot. His plan, after all the other failed endeavours, was a simple, yet horrific one. Kill the king and his brother, the Duke of York. But how? Shoot him while he was at the theatre? Ambush him as he stepped out of a coach? Overturn his barge on the Thames? The barrister Robert West seemed to support the playhouse option. He said his idea would be to plant assassins in the playhouse, in the pit under the King's box, and some at the back of it, armed with pocket pistols, hand blunderbusses or musketoons, and swords who between some of the acts should fire into the box. Others suggested the use of crossbows from Bow Steeple. But the idea that gained real traction was Ferguson's, to ambush the royal brothers as they returned from the horse racing at Newmarket. They would use the RYE House as an ambush spot, as it was located right next to a shortcut for the royal pair. As this plan was discussed and details agreed, the assassination plan was to be called the Lopping Point, whilst the general national uprising was to be called the General Point. But even in the plan's earliest days, there was a stumbling block. Where would the Duke of Monmouth sit in this plan? Would he be king? A regent? A Lord Protector? A stadtholder like William of Orange? There was an even greater and graver issue for the plotters if this murderous scheme was to succeed. What would happen to them if they killed Monmouth's father? Would he be merciful? Grateful? Vengeful? Nathaniel Wade was in little doubt as to the fate of the perpetrators. The Duke of Monmouth could not, if he should be king, refuse the execution of justice upon us for the murder of his father and uncle. Some of the plotters seemed to care little, for one said, "Then whatever great men say, he must be served in the same manner." But the Lopping Point, and indeed the General Point, seemed to have hit a snag when Ferguson explained a brief meeting with the Duke of Monmouth. With the conversation being manoeuvred around to the King and Duke of York, Monmouth was to reply, "You must look upon me in the capacity of a son." Robert West again described this conversation as dampened and clogged their designs. But the assassination of the two most powerful men in the country was not receiving support from Shaftesbury's great and noble men such as Essex and Russell. Russell was a religious man and was disgusted in the way arbitrary government was creeping into English life. Yet he did not want to go as far as assassinating the king. The Earl of Essex was the son of a royalist soldier who was executed by Cromwell's orders, and like Russell had a great respect for Monmouth and would dearly like to see him as monarch. But he was too honourable or too timid to be part of any regicide. While Shaftesbury and Ferguson were attempting to convince other great men to be involved in this great enterprise, Ferguson visited Monmouth. Amongst other things, Ferguson explained the Lopping Point. Monmouth was appalled and horrified at the very idea of killing his father and uncle. His views also distanced himself from Shaftesbury even further. When hearing of Monmouth's distaste for the enterprise, Shaftesbury complained to Lord Grey, "My Lord Russell is also too wary and too timorous a man for such an undertaking as ours." Russell and Monmouth advised caution, as Grey replied that Shaftesbury knew that patience would see the destruction of all of them. Shaftesbury, now full of bile and anger, snapped, "Since I see that you, your grace, have forsaken me, I am resolved to stand upon my legs, act by myself, and have the honour of saving the kingdom." Monmouth leant over to Lord Grey and whispered in his ear, "My lord's acting will be running away." Then turning to his former staunch supporter exclaimed, "Where, my lord, are your 10,000 men quartered?" This was referring to the often quoted private army of the Earl of Shaftesbury, his 10,000 brisk boys of Wapping. Shaftesbury would not be drawn and replied, "I shall tell no man that, but you will see them at Whitehall gates before you are many days older." Yet Monmouth knew the truth, just like he knew what a rabble was, and how a well-trained and equipped army would decimate it in a matter of moments. He also knew the truth behind the Earl's mystical army. He knew it was not so vast, that it was poorly equipped and not ready to rise. He also knew all too well the strength, numbers, and dispositions of the royal army, for he had been their captain general. He had recruited, trained, and garrisoned the army, and he knew how they were positioned in prominent positions around the capital. He knew how they would react in any insurrection, how many men it would take to overcome them, and how quick a reaction would be. For any future rebellion to succeed, he could not rely on an uprising occurring in a single place. There would need to be separate risings to disperse the royal forces, to give him the time to recruit, train, and drill sufficient forces. 2 areas were prime for these diversions already, and areas where the Duke had been previously. One area with garlands in his hand, the other with his sword drawn. The first area was the West Country, and in particular that hotbed of dissent and nonconformity, Taunton. His tour of 1680, as well as a publicity triumph, had shown Monmouth that there was a huge base of support for him, as well as enough arms and ammunition for a supposed rebellion. With this knowledge, he sent word to John Trenchard, MP for Taunton, and son-in-law of George Speke, who had entertained Monmouth at the time was near. Trenchard was to forward this message to all the western leaders for them to ready themselves. Trenchard himself vowed to raise 1,000 foot soldiers and 200 to 300 cavalry. The other end of the British Isles was looking ripe for rebellion as well. Despite Monmouth defeating the Covenanters in the Battle of Bothwell Bridge, there were serious rumblings of discontent. The Scottish rebels, alarmed and angered at Charles and his brother's heavy-handed rule, were being led and agitated by the Earl of Argyll. The Earl's father had crowned Charles at Scone in 1651, but even then was executed at the Restoration due to his dealings with the Cromwellian regime. The present Earl seemed to be in just as much hot water. For arguing with York and his rule in Scotland, he had been imprisoned a year before and was facing a charge of treason. Yet Argyll, ever the slippery customer, managed to escape and made his way to London, where he clandestinely kept in touch with Monmouth. Argyll argued that to assist Monmouth, a rising in the lowlands would be beneficial, but it would cost in the region of £20,000. Hard bargaining ensued until an agreement was reached of £8,000 and 1,000 horse to be sent to Scotland. But his whereabouts could not be hidden for long, and so the Scottish Earl fled across the North Sea to Holland. Despite the Earl's flight, the plan for an uprising was still to go ahead. An initial date was set for the 17th of November, an important date in the Protestant calendar, as it was the anniversary of Queen Elizabeth's reign beginning. But when it was known how many soldiers would be on patrol to keep an eye on the festivities and the burning of the Pope's effigy, it was decided the 19th would be more suitable. Whilst these plans were being finalised, Monmouth was already looking at the bigger picture. He knew any uprising would need funds to A. get it started, and B. keep it moving. He therefore began to build a fund of around £25,000 to £30,000. So what was the plan? As soon as the West Country rose in revolt, Shaftesbury's army of brisk boys from Wapping, now under the leadership of Richard Goodenough, would mobilise. At midnight, they would strike. The train bands would be attacked at the locations of Newgate, Aldersgate and Ludgate would be captured and held. He believed he would have to fend off an attack from the King's Guards at Fleetbridge, whilst at Snow Hill he intended to make a barricade and plant 3 or 4 cannon upon ships' carriages. At Fleetbridge he planned to use the cannons upon land carriages and make a breastwork for the musketeers on each side of the bridge next us, and to fill the houses on that side of the ditch with men who should fire from the windows, but the bridge to be clear. It was clear Monmouth did not want his untrained rebels taking on regular soldiers in a firefight out in the open. He wanted them to be behind defences as much as possible. Monmouth also wanted to cut the royalist lines of communication. He ordered Lord Grey to get to London Bridge and deny it to the enemy. Grey said later, "We intended to possess ourselves a London Bridge to cut off the correspondence between Whitehall and the Tower. These 3 posts we thought we could keep with 2,000 men, till the rest were got together and in order." More distractions were ordered. Lord Macclesfield was to attack royal forces in the northwest of the city, whilst another section, or as many men as he could spare, were to cross London Bridge, march to Southwark, then row over from Lambeth to Westminster in lighters, to then attack Whitehall Palace. The amount of planning for this nighttime attack, with barely trained troops, with cavalry, infantry, makeshift artillery, and an amphibious assault, it was to be of D-Day proportions. Well, almost. Monmouth was hoping, however, that this last assault from the river was to prove unnecessary, as by then the king would have retreated to Portsmouth. His fleeing would therefore demoralise any remaining royalist troops, and would therefore hand the city to Monmouth. But even if the plans were looking like they might just succeed, Monmouth was facing some last-minute problems with his senior commanders. Lord Russell, in discussing the plans with Monmouth, voiced his concerns about captured enemy soldiers. "I suppose," said Russell, "that after the thing has succeeded, what must be done next but mustering the guards and killing them in cold blood?" Monmouth would repeat his words he did speak to his father after his return from his triumph at the Battle of Bothwell Bridge. "I could not kill men in cold blood. That is the work only for butchers." London troubles were compounded by depressing news from Monmouth's hoped-for forces in the West Country. By the middle of November, the rebel leadership were eagerly awaiting news of the uprising beginning of the appointed day. But when Monmouth sent word to Trenchard to ensure preparations were underway, he was to be frustrated by the reply. Monmouth fumed and interrogated Trenchard on why the situation was so different now to the one he had promised. It was reported Trenchard turned so pale that it was thought he would have fainted. Trenchard immediately convened a meeting of all the great men in the area who were supposed to rise with him. After a lengthy discussion, he was forced to report that the rising is impossible. I cannot get the gentlemen of the West to stir yet. Lord Grey, ready for action, wrote, "This put a great daunt upon us." Monmouth, though disappointed, tried his hardest to maintain the morale and the momentum of his supporters. "Though we are put off now, we must not be idle, for it will be impossible to hold off any longer. I have been at Wapping all night, and never saw brisker or braver fellows in my life. I have been around the Tower and seen the avenues of it, and I do not think it will be hard in a little time to possess ourselves of it. We are engaged to be ready in a fortnight, and therefore now we must apply ourselves as well as we can." It clearly wasn't just rhetoric, as he finished by ordering Ferguson to obtain 4 more gun carriages for their next attempt. But despite Monmouth's optimism, the plan was to crumble before him, and very quickly. The details of the lopping point were dropped, probably accidentally to Monmouth, by Howard of Escrick. Monmouth erupted with genuine anger. "God so, kill the king? I'll never suffer that." His father must have annoyed him, frustrated him, angered him, but deep down he would not see him killed. He wanted him saved from his wicked counsel, and particularly that of his uncle, the Duke of York. Monmouth knew it wasn't a question of whether there would be a rebellion, but when. His goal was to save his father and avoid a bloodbath and another civil war. He passed word to Sir Thomas Armstrong to act quickly. The lopping point and all activities connected with it were to cease, and cease immediately. To show Monmouth that it was definitely not the time for an uprising, on the 19th of November, the day of the planned revolt, there was a fire in the City of London. On the same day, Shaftesbury, on hearing the news that troops were on their way to arrest him, decided to flee. He took boat at Gravesend, and with a small band of his fellow conspirators, including Robert Ferguson, sailed to Holland. Shaftesbury may or may not have known, but in 2 months the Whig leader would be dead. The man who had once been part of Charles II's cabal, the man who had connived into turning Monmouth from Captain General to rebel chief, was gone. On hearing Shaftesbury had fled the country, the Duke of York wrote to his nephew and son-in-law, William of Orange. His letter ran, "We shall see who will take his place." But everyone knew, even if they did not say it, it had to be Monmouth. Monmouth, as ever, was a flurry of activity, and began building a new administration for his plans. With Shaftesbury gone and soon dead, his council consisted of Algernon Sidney, Russell, Essex, Hampden, and Howard of Escrick. Lord Grey, who would be his incompetent cavalry commander in 1685, would have been present too, but at the moment he was in disgrace. He had been found guilty of abducting his young sister-in-law and then refused to hand her over to her father, the Earl of Berkeley. His outrageous excuse was, "I married her eldest sister and expected a maiden's hand, but not finding it, I resolved to find one in the family, if any be left." Algernon Sidney, who you may remember from Monmouth's early life in Holland, was put in charge of the Scottish side of the upcoming rebellion. He was to be the key communicator with the Earl of Argyll. For this purpose, he sent one Aaron Smith into the Lowlands to report back. Sidney was a supporter of Scotland being the main front to the rebellion, and believed it was essential that Monmouth was there. Yet Monmouth, as always, thought the key was still the West Country. He believed it was more agreeable that he commanded there, as Trenchard stated, "The West would not engage to rise, but upon the promise of the Duke of Monmouth being with them." Grey, despite his public scandal, was still being asked for advice, and stated any rebellion needed to occur before the harvest, when the largest number of country folk were available. At the same time, Argyll was to be sent the agreed thousands of pounds to set the lowlands ablaze. Monmouth, who would be hiding in Grey's house near Chichester, would wait until he had heard the Scottish uprising had begun. He would then take to horse and gallop to Taunton, and there raise his standard. Lord Macclesfield, now not needed in London, would rouse Cheshire and the other great men there. Even now, with so much talk of treason, arms being stored, plans being discussed, the king refused to move on his rebellious son, even when the facts were so plain to see. Monmouth had ridden to Chichester with Grey to see how many cavalry they could raise there. The plan was for 800 horsemen to greet them. But the Sheriff of Chichester, having received orders from the king, made sure that Monmouth was not met by a cavalry force, but the king's troopers. He was still allowed in the city, and was welcomed by around 1,000 supporters, all chanting, "A Monmouth! A Monmouth!" A paper ran, "The rabble behaved very tumultuously, and insolently, wishing him welcome with loud acclamations, and withal swore they would set the crown on the Duke of Monmouth's head, in spite of all the Tory soldiers." Now this next part of Monmouth's life seems to sum up how crazy the 17th century could be. Here is a royal duke, the eldest son of a king, planning and recruiting for a nationwide rebellion, who takes time out to travel to France to take part in horse racing. The popularity of horse racing, which must be attributed to the king, as well as Monmouth, was grasped by the Sun King, Louis XIV. The French monarch, to build up interest, offered 10,000 pistoles as the main prize for the race at Saint-Germain. Entries came in from all over France, Europe, and a little-known gelding who was to be ridden by a certain green ribbonite. Could this be Monmouth? What seemed incredible finally occurred. Monmouth, still famous in France after his heroics at Maastricht, appeared on a fine dark horse and breezed past the finishing post with plenty of distance to spare. Monmouth was also honoured by being allowed to drive his coach right behind the French king's. Louis knew Monmouth was in semi-disgrace back in England, and so was he snubbing his cousin, Charles II. But despite being lauded in all this splendour, trouble was again brewing back in England. Lord Grey, one of the few members of the nobility who had constantly shown support for Monmouth, was in the dock. After being found guilty of starting a riot and assaulting the Tory Mayor of London, his house was searched and 80 firelocks were found. Of course, being Lord Grey, he had an answer, and of course he got off. His luck will stick with him for years to come. He told the court, "They were bought long before, and very publicly, and lay so in my house to full view of my servants for near 2 years, and were not bought with any other intent but to furnish my 3 houses in Essex, Sussex, and Northumberland." Just to be sure, he reminded the court that he had been forced into recognizance of £20,000 for the keeping of the peace. But as Grey was again escaping by the skin of his teeth, the plan of the lopping point was fast becoming public knowledge. The bankrupt dyer named Josiah Keeling decided to earn some cash, turn Judas, and tell the authorities all that he knew. he crept into the offices of Lord Dartmouth, the Duke of York's aide, and voiced his concerns that last April a plan had been put in place for murdering not only the king, but Dartmouth's lord and master as well. The plan, as Keeling said, would be to wait in ambush as the two royal brothers returned from the horse racing at Newmarket. The ambush place was to be as before, the RYE house belonging to Captain Rumbold, a key Whig plotter. Keeling continued, 2 assassins in labourers' overalls were to drag a cart into the path of the royal coach to block its route. Then musketeers would pour a deadly volley into the carriage, killing the king, the Duke of York, and the royal guards. As soon as the regicide had taken place, they would ride for London, and so open rebellion would begin. It was only by the lucky chance that there had been a fire at Newmarket the other week, forcing the royal brothers to leave early, that their lives had been saved. This news was dynamite to the royal court, and gold dust to the Duke of York. He had always wanted proof that his aggravating nephew, wanting him and his father out of the way, and now he had it. News spread like wildfire. Pamphlets, broadsheets, pulpits, coffee houses, everywhere the talk was of an assassination avoided, dangerous men waiting to rebel, and most shockingly of all to the public, the Duke of Monmouth had a hand in these devilish happenings. But what were the original conspirators to do? Men had not lain in ambush, nor had an assassination come near to taking place. Monmouth himself had previously ordered that all plans and activities referring to the lopping point were to be cancelled. Men panicked. Some turned informer. Others fled. Some believed keeping their heads down and waiting for it to blow over would be sufficient. In the smoke-filled, gloomy Whig taverns, men whispered and worried. What were they to do? Ferguson and Armstrong, with £500 on each of their heads, fled to Holland. When Ferguson saw his fellows suffering from the rough crossing over the North Sea, he roared with laughter. "Gentlemen, you are strangers to this kind of exercise. I've been used to fly. I'll never leave off as long as I live, and I hope to see some of you at Dunbar before Michaelmas." But as Ferguson and Armstrong sailed across the North Sea to safety, Lord Grey was again achieving the unbelievable. With the outcry of the RYE House plot now in the open, Lord Grey was arrested in London. With the gates of the Tower of London locked, his guard took him to the Rummer Tavern for the night to keep watch on him. Grey, with money on him, got his guard drunk, and as the redcoat passed out, Grey escaped down to the Thames to find a boat. An alarm was raised, and a soldier from the Tower spotted Grey and was quickly bribed by him not only to not arrest him, but to desert and join him in escaping. Yep, this succeeded as well. Grey was not content with fleeing the country with just this random tower guard. With his companion, he raced to Up Park to pick up his sister-in-law, Lady Henrietta Berkeley, and 2 servants. A spy reported later, "At an arm of the sea, 5 men in disguise and a woman, and by all circumstances, it is the Duke of Monmouth, Lord Grey, and others of their gang, for they walked in a wood for hours off the tide." This suspicious party was soon at Flushing, from where they travelled to Cleves to join Armstrong and Ferguson. But of course, Monmouth was not with them. Monmouth was still in England, as was a fellow conspirator, Howard of Escrick, who had hidden himself in his Knightsbridge house in a cunning hole behind a hanging. As soon as Escrick was captured, he ratted on his companions. Sir Charles Littleton reported his less than heroic actions upon his arrest. So soon as he came to the king, he fell a-crying bitterly. He desired pen and paper that he might recollect and discover what he knew, so has been writing his narrative ever since. This damning evidence was enough to get Essex, Hampden and Russell locked in the Tower. They had been assured that there was no real evidence against them, and so were all at their homes when they were arrested. The shock must have been all the greater when they were told they were being held on the charge of treason. Yet Monmouth, as always, looked out for his friends, even if it was to his own detriment. As soon as he heard Russell had been taken, Monmouth managed to smuggle a note into his friend. It ran, "I'll come in and we'll run fortunes together." Russell replied stoically, "It will be no advantage for my friends to die with me." Monmouth kept away and stayed in hiding despite a serious manhunt taking place for him. All of Monmouth's household, his wife, the Duchess, and even his coachman were questioned. His coachman, one Mr. Welch, was attacked by a group of soldiers, cursing Welch for wearing a Whig's livery, and cut his face with a set of shears. Welch was clearly made of stern stuff and faced up to a gnarly-faced sergeant. He fell into a passion, roaring the evidence against his master was from a company of perjured rogues who were not to be believed. The sergeant barked back, "If his grace be clear, why does he not render himself to the king and council and justify himself?" Welch would not submit and replied, "'Tis not fit for my master to appear before his enemy without his sword in his hand." Monmouth, whether with sword in hand or not, knew London was just too hot to hold for him. After several close shaves, including one rooftop escape, he fled the capital. But where to go? The west, where his supporters were? Chester likewise would have welcomed and hidden him. Scotland and join the rebellious lowlanders? No, he would travel north, via Hampstead, Hendon and Edgware. By June of that year, he had arrived at Toddington House, a vast country estate in Bedfordshire. This was to be his home and hideaway for the next 5 months. But who lived here, and why would they harbour the now rebel Duke? The house was owned by one Baroness Wentworth, Henrietta, the woman whom he would always remember dearly as his wife. Their fortunes would be linked from now on, but their story must wait until our next video. If you're enjoying our series on my hero James Scott, Duke of Monmouth, please drop us a like and a share. We'd really appreciate it. As always, thanks for watching.